Hello and welcome to Russia in Focus, my monthly update on opinion polls conducted in Russia by the Levada Center. This month we take a walk around the data. What you're looking at is a Jupyter notebook and I'm using Python. Now let's say that I want to show you the opinion polls results for approval rating for President Putin. If I opened up the tabular data, it's difficult to make sense of this kind of data. Python is very good because now with another couple of packages we can run this data into a graphing package. Now this is a month-on-month data and it's a bit misleading as a graph because if you look at the side it goes from just below 60% to 90%. The graph has been designed to just encapsulate the data. However, the indicator I'm using, the range is 0 to 100. So we run another graph. Let's give you a bit more accurate idea of what's going on. Now the solid line in a slightly different blue is the median for the year. Even at its lowest, approval ratings for Mr. Putin in its over 20 years as president of Russia have remained way above 60%. The data is telling us one story, that overall Russians are quite supportive of President Putin, and the support has gone up and down over time but has always remained in positive, very positive territory. Now, we need to add a bit more data to give some context to this. And I think a good place to start is conflicts. The Russian Federation from its start has been involved in a number of conflicts. And now we have the median approval rating, but we have vertical lines to plot conflicts. So this was the Georgian War in 2008. And it seems that after the war, popularity for Mr. Putin went up a bit. 2014 to 2015 was the first stage of the Ukrainian war. Shortly after the start of the war, with the annexation of Crimea, popularity for Mr. Putin went up. And it stayed relatively up and then it started declining. It went at its lowest 2021, coming out of the pandemic. That was very common at the time. A lot of leaders found themselves in hot water during the pandemic, towards the end, related to issues that were caused by the pandemic. And then it goes straight up again shortly after war is declared on Ukraine and Russian troops invade Ukraine. Approval for the president, it's a hard indicator. A different indicator, which is a bit softer and it's a bit more about how people feel, is how they respond to a question, how they feel about how the country is being run, or as it's formally called on the Levada Center website, an assessment of the situation in the country. And we can see that in the late 90s, people in Russia didn't think the country was being run very well. The rushed economic reforms caused a lot of pain and instability inside Russia. President Putin definitely brought stability to the economic scene and the country. And over time, approval of the way this country is being run had gone up around the time of the Georgian War. A positive response to assessing how the country is being run goes up. Then it starts ebbing down again, and it goes up at the time of the first Ukrainian War, 2014-2015, of the first stage of the war in Ukraine with the annexation of Crimea. And we have the initiation of the second stage of the war in Ukraine, and it goes up again. I think the data, graphed as I did, gives us an idea that there isn't a lot of opposition to the idea of war, or specifically to the war in Ukraine. there's a lot of talk about the economics, but if we plot the real GDP growth against the approval ratings, the GDP growth rate comes from the IMF. We can see that in the early years, a positive assessment of how the country was being run and the approval of the president were somewhat linked, or appear to be linked by graphing it this way, to economic growth or economic stability. But when it comes to the wars, there is a definite change. First stage of the war in Ukraine, with the annexation of Crimea, the approval ratings and the assessment of how the country is being run go up, even if GDP goes down. And from then on, what GDP does seems to be separate from how Russians perceive either the president or how the political class is running the country. And this graph is using normalized values because I have a range for the Deloitte stats which goes from 0 to 100, the ones I'm using. But the GDP, it's a percentage change. So for the purpose of this graph, we are more interested in looking at how the numbers move than the actual value. However, for clarity, the values for the opinion poll results have been normalized using a mean standard deviation, i.e. the mean of the values is 0 and all the values are plotted for how far away from that mean they are, the standard deviation. Now in this graph, I have normalized the GDP data as well. Immediately you see that the curves have been exploded. And that's a numbers trick fundamentally, so that when I graph you can see better where it goes up and down and how it moves. But I would expect to see much more of an impact of GDP growth on the consumer sentiment index, because fundamentally consumer sentiment index, it's all about how comfortable or confident you are into purchasing big ticket items, and you wouldn't spend that kind of money if you were not somewhat secure of your economic situation. So now I have a CSI, a consumer sentiment index, but I'm using the percentage change, which kind of mirror the percentage change as calculated in the gross domestic product or GDP. So we can see that here GDP goes up and the consumer sentiment index goes up a bit, people get more comfortable. There is a bit of a delay, of course. In this graph, I'm using the GDP normalized against the normalized consumer sentiment index, mainly to show you the curve a bit better. So we can see that in the 90s, or they were called the wild 90s, consumer sentiment index was extremely low. As the economy starts to stabilize and Russia returns to growth, consumer sentiment index goes up, and it's still going up. In 2008, 2009, when Russia is involved in a war with Georgia, as well as the worldwide economic crisis or the banking crash. Then consumer sentiment index goes down, where it returns quite quickly to a good level. The next crash is not until 2016, 2017, 2018, and then it starts to go up again. And the end of the COVID, there is a lot of uncertainty, and at the beginning of, and then in 2022, at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, there is a lot of uncertainty. It's low, but since then it's gone up. And consumer sentiment index, especially in the last few years, seems to be somewhat at odds with the gross domestic product, which is not a cure-all indicator, but it gives us an idea. If the economy is doing well, people make the economy, which means that people are doing all right. There seems to be that approval goes up when Russia goes to war, but not with everybody. There is definitely a certain amount of sensitivity when it comes to conflict with ex-Soviet member states. And there has been a lot of censorship going on in Russia, especially since 2014, with regards to what can and cannot be said about the military operations, about the political class. And the media have become less and less free. And most of the main media in Russia at the moment are controlled by people affiliated in one way or another to the Kremlin. Even so, the approval ratings for Mr. Putin have been high even before all these measures were introduced. There is a bedrock of approval for the way the country is run and for the current ruling elite inside Russia. I touched on the GDP also because the GDP is a rule of thumb that helps us evaluate what's going on, also because it's a common measure. The IMF calculates the GDP for nearly every country on earth. All the harmonizing of the numbers has been done for us, so it makes easier to make comparisons. Now, as you know, not all the G20 countries have agreed on sanctioning Russia. These are the figures for the GDP growth in 2023. And as you can see from the graph, the country in pink are the ones that decided not to sanction Russia. And the countries in green are the ones that decided to sanction Russia. We can see that economic growth is much more muted in the countries that decided to sanction Russia. This is much more marked in traditional trading partners. For example, Italy and Germany and the United Kingdom used to do a lot of trade with Russia. The European Union, we can see the numbers. In 2022, we all thought we were going to have a jolly good time. COVID was finally over, and then the war hit, and the growth was in 2023 was 0.6 for the whole of the European Union. Some states performed better than others. 2024, 1.1. Now, if we take Turkey, which is a neighbor of the European Union and a member of the G20, and they have not sanctioned Russia, their growth for this year is forecasted at 4.5. Last year was at 5.5. To conclude, data can tell us the story. And one of the stories telling us is that Putin still enjoys and has enjoyed for the past 20-odd years support in Russia. So his vision for Russia is still popular inside Russia. It also tells us, when we put some simple economic data against it, the economic considerations are not the only or the primary driving force. And that's not just true inside Russia, it's true outside Russia. For example, in Europe, it made no economic sense for Europe to either support Ukraine or impose any sanctions on Russia. It's a matter of values, of what Europeans value, of the importance of a belief system, of ethics, of an ideology, a belief in democracy, a belief in respect for neighboring countries, a belief in cooperation versus aggression. And I believe that once you are part of the European Union and the NATO group, you should enjoy a sense of security, which directly or indirectly Russia challenged all these very core values by invading Ukraine. So the economic considerations come second to the value and ideology considerations. And that's the end of the monthly update. And I hope, if you don't already, will really start enjoying data, because this is a small sample of the data which is freely available on the internet. And I hope you suddenly developed a intrinsic and deep love for data. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. Have a lovely day. Bye bye.